The second thing I want to say is something that's less personal, and that is this year is 2019. And the significance of this year is not that it's the year before a presidential election, although that's important too. Significance of this year is that this is the 400th anniversary of the African American community in North America. In 1619, the first enslaved Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia. And it was the beginning of it was a continuation of a huge human tragedy that had started, actually long before that began, with Columbus's arrival in the New World. But bigger than that, that was in many profound ways the birth of America itself. I always tell people that the way to think about enslavement in this country is not as a thing that is incidental to America's rise, to America's power, to America's dreams, to America's promises of democracy, but it's something that made all of those things possible. It's the road on which everything that we talk about and brag about is built. So much that you literally cannot imagine America without enslavement. One can speak of the sheer material resources extracted for over 250 years from the bodies of African Americans. Black people in this country were slaves for almost twice as long as we've been free in this country. One can speak about the culture that black people forged under that enslavement. America's greatest export during the time of enslavement was the cotton that went through the hands of black people. At this moment, America's greatest export is its pop culture. What would American pop culture be without black people? I don't mean that in the stereotypical sense. I mean literally try to subtract black people and imagine American music. Try to subtract American racism and imagine the world of film. First big film in this country's history is Birth of a Nation. I don't think that's a mistake. Try to imagine American literature, not just without Toni Morrison, not just without James Baldwin, not just without Zora Neale Hurston, not just without Richard Wright, but on the other side of the ledger, without Gone with the Wind, which is a reimagining and attempt to hide history.
It's interesting that you talked about, in your introductory remarks, remembering and being willing to do the hard work of remembering. And so much of your reading for me is about calling the past into the present. And talking about that as well, you talked about not really acknowledging the role of Africans in America and building the country into what it is today. So I immediately thought about the moment when Michelle Obama mentioned that black folks had helped build the White House.
People were incredulous.
People were not pleased. So, we haven't been willing to do the work. What are the impediments to that?
I think more than people being incredulous, I think the bigger thing was people couldn't actually believe it factually. It's one thing to be offended by something, but they couldn't even believe it was true, which was actually, quite the deeper statement for me about the profound ignorance in this country about not just the role that black people themselves have played. There we go. Not just the role black people themselves have played, but a profound ignorance on the extent to which the country itself rests on the great crime of white supremacy. And while the National Mall in the White House is a great symbol of this, it really extends out over everything. I did a piece a few years ago arguing for reparations, and the crux of that was the formation of the suburbs in our cities, and the deep-seated belief, and this is within the lifetime of many of us in this room, but the deep-seated belief that the suburbs around our cities bloomed just out of magic. And the kind of, sort of inner city neighborhoods that, I grew up in, and some of us in this neighborhood grew up in, were just like that because. And people believe that. They don't, have a sense of how, they themselves, how their ancestors and elders, and how their government actually shapes policy. Not only did black people literally build the White House, it just would not be a White House. Thomas Jefferson couldn't have been president
Right.
George Washington couldn't have been, I think and I think it's really important to talk about this given the year we're in. For the research I had to do for that story, I spent quite a bit of time down at Monticello, which is like a death camp, for my money as far as I'm concerned, or a work camp, a concentration camp, however you want to call it. And on this subject of remembering, one of the fascinating things to me was to be in this place where every bit of it was made possible through the robbery, of black people, of their bodies, of their labor, of their entirety. And you see people there like giving champagne toasts and kids, running through. It's like they don't quite know what happened here. Like they think Thomas Jefferson just sort of dreamed this up and like carved it out of the clouds and, set it all down that way. It's just a great metaphor for this country. Jefferson was brilliant. Washington was brilliant. These people are brilliant. But their lives were made possible by robbery. And that's just, it's hard for us to get our heads around that,
I mean, they were both slaveholders.
Yes.
So, which is your point.
Yes.
And it's interesting how even in the South these days, and I'm from Mississippi, so I know a little bit about it. There's still a lot of glorification of the antebellum period and what was made possible by the slave labor of African people. And yet, you're right, it's almost like it happened metaphysically. Those people were not there except when you needed a cool glass of tea.
Right.
They weren't really there and they had no contributions to make. And it's interesting because we see the same kind of negation happening today in terms of how people of color, and African American people in particular, are regarded in this country. There's that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, which is an interesting contrast, there's this notion that racism no longer exists. It's a relic, just like plantation houses are relics of a period gone by. But in fact, they're not relics, and they're really very powerfully present in our systems and structures today. So I'm wondering how you think about that, especially given that our current president often is heard to say the system is rigged. Well, in fact, it is, but not in the way, ironically, that he's talking about. So how do you unpack all that?
I think one of the problems is if you actually do remember, I think it would deeply complicate America's creed. And maybe even, the way, not maybe, I think certainly, even the way, America conducts its foreign policy around the world. It's very hard to invade a country and argue that you are doing so on the basis of democracy if your own democracy, and I'll explain what I mean by that, was formed through the exploitation of other people. And it's important to put that democracy in air quotes, because in fact, for most of this country's history, there wasn't a democracy, right? I mean, you know this from Mississippi, right? I mean, again, within a lot of people's lifetimes in this room, black people in Mississippi couldn't vote, period. Up until roughly 1920 or so, the majority of people living in Mississippi actually were black. Most of them couldn't vote, and so, like, this country has a creed, and I just want to be clear, I think all countries in this way, probably, I suspect, have creedal notions about who they are, and if you did any sort of work, in terms of their history might conflict with who they say. I spent some time living in France. I know this is true of France. With all this liberty, equality, and fraternity. And if you ask the average of the blacks that live over there, they would laugh at you about that. So I don't mean to say the United States is unique or exceptional, except that the United States says it's exceptional. So it would be easy to say, oh yeah, well this is what all countries do. Since the United States says it's not all countries. I mean, that's also part of the creed, right? We're exceptional, kissed by God, called to higher things, not like other countries. And this has been with us, since the first people came here to, settle the country. This idea that you're apart from the sins of old Europe, an aristocracy, and this is a land of freedom, and you wind up just perpetrating the same things that happened in the land that you come from, which speaks to a kind of thing that may be in us as humans, that we need to grapple with. But I think much of this is the very fact that it questions that exceptionalism. It questions, the very creeds that are at our core. And I think it's a tough thing. If you actually actively remembered, then America is a very, very different place than what it presents itself as to the rest of the world.
Right. Well, it's interesting. We're talking about, again, stuff at the systems level. But a lot of times when folks react to the conditions, they react to individual acts, or individual statements. Just this month, and it's just January this year, we've had Representative Steve King say, what's wrong? When did the phrase white nationalism or the phrase white supremacy become a problem? This month as well, you had Dr. James Watson, a Nobel Prize winner, say that, actually, the problem is that people of African descent have lower intelligence. That statement against all empirical and other scientific data to the contrary. And so we then fixate on these statements that individuals make or individual acts. The woman calling the little girl selling bottles of water, right, in San Francisco, and any other number of things that are boosted on social media that we see, where folks act outrageously toward people of another color or background. But I always think that focus on the individual kind of excuses us from looking at the larger forces at play.
No, I think that's true, because I think what people can do is dismiss it as a case of bad apples. I mean, the one I think about, is actually this case we had in Chicago with the killing of the young man with the knife. And they had it on tape and they suppressed the tape. And initially, I think a lot of us thought the cop was going to get off. I know I did. He didn't get off, but when they went to try to prosecute the larger systemic conspiracy, I didn't say the actual cover-up, of the tape in the first place, it was considerably harder. Just yesterday, 3 of the cops who, participated in that got off. It's, the system can throw people away. It can sacrifice individuals, as need be, as long as the core myth can be maintained. And this, again, it goes back to this notion of memory and slavery. And there's this sense that enslavement is this thing that happened a long time ago and, is not no longer with us, and we should forget about it. But the core characteristics of it still haunt us to this very day. It's like I said before, I did my reading. I mean, this notion of America as mostly right, and making a few errors along the way, among them the enslavement of millions of people and the theft of land from the Native Americans. But these are things that made it possible. These aren't along the way things. It's like the steak on the plate, not the roll on the side. Take a steak, we ain't got no dinner, man. Can't have dinner without the steak. And so, but people think it's the roll on the side. That's what they think it's the salad, they don't get it as part of the main thing. I Condoleezza Rice used to have this thing years ago. Slavery's our birth defect. Slavery's our birth. It's not the birth defect. It's the birth, I mean, you would not have had the birth without, I believe in 1860, the point at which the Civil War commences, 60% of our exports are cotton. Majority of people living in Mississippi, living in South Carolina are black and enslaved at the start of the Civil War. What would America itself be had there not been a Civil War? These are things too large to subtract from America. The current construct, as I was saying earlier, of our cities and our suburbs, you can't really imagine that if you don't imagine the reforms under Roosevelt during the New Deal, the FHA, loan program. And you can't imagine that without racism, because it was racism that made that possible in the first place. It was the exclusion of large amounts of black people. And I think the hard thing is even the things we are proud of are ultimately tainted And you can only be so proud. So the one thing that politicians, for instance, across the board always agree on is the GI Bill. How great the GI Bill was and allowed the greatest generation to, and I just use this as an example because I think there are others, allowed the greatest generation who fought in this, great war and, saved the world from the Nazis to come back, get an education, and that's what America is all about. But huge numbers of black people were excluded from the GI Bill. Indeed, there would not have been a GI Bill if those black people had not been excluded. It's hard, man. I mean, and as a writer, there are certain, I think, writers who see themselves as reinforcers of myth, although I guess they wouldn't call it myth, but that's pretty much what they're doing. But I have to live in this, what I consider a much more difficult place, where there's nothing really to go home to. Do you know what I mean? There's no good night story to be read. There's no fairy tale. There's no, it all ends well. It was all, yes, there was some problems, but it was all great. There are no, untainted heroes in this. And we're a culture right now, and a country right now, which has this need for untainted heroes and ideals. And that is deeply, deeply in conflict, as far as I'm concerned, with what we say is our core aim of equality and democracy. The only road to that, I think, actually is through the remembering, through the rejection of death, through the rejection of things as things of being untainted and pure. You got to confront Jefferson for who he was, and all that that means, i.e. Jefferson standing for the history, in a broad sense.
And so, why can't we do better now? Here's the thing, Dr. Maya Angelou, of course, what I'll say, when you know better, you do better. Now, we're enlightened these days, right? We all understand what needs to happen. And I'm trying to figure out, is it fear? Is it power? What is it that prevents us from doing the hard work of remembering now?
I think a lot of things would break. I think that's the bottom line. I don't think that it's a mistake that the greatest reforms in this country's history happen at periods when there have been extremely disruptive contemporaneous events, usually war. It's not incidental that it took the Civil War for the abolition of enslavement in this country. Enslavement at that point became inconvenient. It is not a mistake that in the shadow of World War II, and in fact the Cold War, you had the Civil Rights Movement. This is not to take anything away from the activists during the Civil Rights Movement, but Bobby Kennedy, when he looks at the Freedom Riders, is very clear, about the effect of the Freedom Riders and the effect of people, not the Freedom Riders, people bombing Freedom Riders, and attacking Freedom Riders, about what effect that has on America's desire to project itself as a land of freedom to the broader world. But what I'm saying is that injustice in this country, and probably in most countries, tends to perpetuate itself until those with the critical mass of power can no longer tolerate it. And the bottom line is, right now in this country, white supremacy is quite obviously tolerable. People feel that way. There's no other way, as far as I am concerned, to explain the election of Donald Trump. This is not a hard call. This is not something that you have to read somebody's mind to figure out. When someone says, I don't want this person presiding over my case because they're a Mexican, not incidentally, because they're a Mexican, it shouldn't be hard to figure it out. When somebody calls for the death penalty, for the young men who were locked up for the Central Park jogger rape, and not just at the time, but even after they're proven innocent, continues to call for it. It shouldn't be that hard to figure out. When someone literally tries to perpetrate a Muslim ban, that's what he called it. And in fact does, once he becomes president, but says that, during the campaign, it shouldn't be that hard to figure out. When somebody wants to build a wall, which is no real security usage, which shut down the government. I mean, if you can't, see that, I don't know, what are you, illiterate? You can't. That's when conversation breaks down, because at that point, they can't be, if if that's not clear, then nothing is clear. You know, then the sky is not blue, you know what I mean? There's no sun. You know, like you get into a realm where you are not in the universe of shared facts. And so, but I'm saying that people make a decision not to live in a universe of shared facts.
But how did he get elected? So, you know, because there was a lot of conversation in my community about it being, you know, a reaction to a black president. You know, and then of course, you read in all the media in different places, no, it's economic anxiety. It's economic anxiety. But you know, it's interesting.
I mean, it is economic anxiety.
Well, yes, okay.
Directed towards black people.
Yes. But, you know, even back as far back as 2012, when Obama was re-elected, I was reading about, many years ago, about how in the immediate aftermath of that election, 25,000 people in Georgia, 25,000 people in Louisiana, 25,000 people in Texas, and another 25 or more in Tennessee, and another 25 or more in Florida, all voted to secede from the United States. To secede. So, you know, what that...
I mean, it shouldn't be that shocking to us.
So was he elected because we didn't want another black president?
I think the short version is correct. Yeah, I think, you know, I think a lot is made over the great celebratory feeling that black people had, and you know, to an extent, you know, a large part of this country had. I shouldn't just say black people, but a large part of this country of a particular political bent had when Barack Obama was elected. You know, he evoked certain feelings, I think, you know, among a lot of Americans, period, regardless of race, about a desire to be better. And I mean, independent of policy, I mean, the person, Barack Obama as a symbol, evokes certain feelings, you know, just, you know, in the way that he presents himself to us about being better. But there are other people who have other ideas about America. And there always have been. And I mean, it's not just Trump, it's the fact that I think the Tea Party started like a month after Obama was inaugurated. It was and this is not coincidental. Like it's not a mistake. It's not just, you know, an overlap. You know, Donald Trump enters into the political conversation as a birther and rises to becoming president. That in and of itself should be a deep statement on the power of white supremacy. And it's not just that. It's the fact that when he became president, he was able to cow many of the people who called him a racist and a xenophobe in his own party. Lindsey Graham is one of his biggest allies now. There's a literal video of Lindsey Graham talking about how Donald Trump is a racist. You don't have to listen to me talking about Donald Trump. Listen to Lindsey Graham. You know what I mean? And that should be a statement to you about the amount of power, you know, that Trump enjoys. It was, I just have to say, it's a congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She went on 60 Minutes and said that Trump was a racist, and there was this big flare-up. Yeah. You know, I was like, but Lindsey Graham said that. Like, this was already said by people in his party. It was only 2 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. It was recently. I remember. I saw it. You know, but people decide to live in a world of alternative facts, you know?
So you talked about great shifts, or profound shifts happening oftentimes in the wake of disruptive moments, war, that sort of thing. I think about the election of Barack Obama as a disruptive moment. We've now had a reaction to that disruptive moment. But I wonder where it might all end up, because I don't think, obviously, we're at the end. Right. And more recently, I think about the gubernatorial campaigns of Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams coming so close to winning those elections. What is that telling us? Will there be a backlash to that too?
Probably so. I mean, that's the way it goes. You know, in fact, I think that's already started. I believe that in Florida, DeSantis is trying to, you know, they passed this law to make it easier for right. I think they're trying to roll that back like right now. So the backlash has already begun, and I'm just not following the news in Georgia, but I can bet you, you know, any amount of money that's going on in Georgia right now too. Yes. I think it's a testament to the fact that, you know, there's always resistance. People always fight back, you know, as they well should. The problem is that, unlike in past generations or past centuries, we're on a clock. The clock is global warming. There is indelible damage being done to the planet right now. So this can't go on for like the next 1,000 years. It's not. You just can't. There can't be a back and forth. We won't be here if that's the case. So one of the unfortunate things is the great forces of evil in this country and in this world. Like the old song says, time is on their side. It's not on our side. And so we need more immediate victories. I think that's the scariest thing, about this moment. Because I do think there's something to be said for great ideas that are supported and can be presented for ultimately winning out. I don't necessarily believe that, but I think, I don't think people are wrong, for putting their hope in that. But global warming really complicates that. There's no planet where people can present those ideas. And those ideas don't matter anymore. It won't matter what happened if Florida's flooded, So I think that's the real complicating factor.
So I want to shift just a little bit to talk about something that's adjacent, which is around the juxtaposition of class versus race. A lot of times people use these notions interchangeably, and we can deal with inequality if we just deal with socioeconomic needs, divorcing that from the notion of race. What's your take on that?
Well, my take is race is class. Black people are class in America, and always have been. It's quite clear that there is not a single, I don't think, phenomenon or evil under the umbrella of white supremacy that I've mentioned or that I can think of that does not have an economic component. At the end of the day, it will always, even birth rates, even things that seem, wholly symbolic, will ultimately, if you start doing the math, be reduced down to the idea of economics. This country, even though it doesn't say this in the Constitution, you can see it, when you listen to many of the people who have held office in this country's history, many people who have formed the imaginative conscience. Many of these, this country's artists, before we got to a more elevated generation like you guys, reinforce this notion that America is not just built on democracy and freedom, but it's built on a servile class, a permanent servile class. That's a deep-seated belief in this country, and it's one that goes back at least to the antebellum period, when you hear people arguing for enslavement, as John C. Calhoun, Senator for South Carolina, called it a positive good. This is the notion that actually led to some 800,000 Americans being killed in the Civil War. It wasn't simply that the Confederacy wanted slavery to continue. They wanted a society where slavery was protected in perpetuity, literally in the Constitution of the Confederacy. So don't let, not that any of you guys, this audience ever would, but don't let anybody ever tell you about states' rights or why did the North do this or why. The Confederacy started this way. They fired on a federal fort. That's what actually happened. And what they fired on a federal fort in defense of was the right to own people. And you see it even post-slavery. Segregation as a force basically promises to have black people remain as a servile class. That's the promise of segregation. And it's economics all through this. Voting is not a merely symbolic act. So when they strip black people of the right to vote in redemption, they're not stripping black people of this, fun, lively activity. They're not merely stripping them of their civic duty. They're stripping them of the ability to have any sort of say over the coffers that are governed by the politics in that state. So if I erect a swimming pool for you that is of low quality and one for me that is of high quality, if I erect a public university system, which I give the majority of resources to, and another which I give very few resources to, I have a public school system, I erect one for you here and one for me over here, and I put all of the resources in this one under the aegis of separate but equal. That's class. That's class. Because I'm restricting you economically in a particular way. Not only that, it's actually robbery. Because what I'm doing is I'm taking the tax office, which you pay into, and I'm giving all of them to me. It's civic robbery, and it's also classist. So I think, two things. The first being what I just said. People think like racism is like white people not being nice to black people. When in fact, the essence of it is theft. That's the essence of the core of it is theft. It's taking. It's always taking. It's always a reappropriation, and that is nothing but class politics in and of itself. The second portion of that is, this notion, which is not just propagated, on the left, but it's been propagated across, the entire span of the Democratic Party, that somehow, and I'm talking, from Clinton over to Sanders to whoever, somehow you can address racism through what these people would describe as classmates. We already tried that. We tried doing the New Deal. That's what the New Deal was. That's what it was supposed to be. And it was quite clear that those laws could be finagled and written in such a way that allow for the erection and the creation of a kind of white middle class, while black people retain their same space as a servile class in this society. So I find that most of the time when people are talking about, class, when I hear people talking about quote-unquote class politics, and they are including racism. They are correcting for racism. They are correcting for white supremacy, which you must do in any sort of policy in this country as far as I'm concerned, given our history. If you are doing, what you really are talking about is white class politics. That's what you don't even talk about class politics. You're talking about white class politics. Politics under the rubric of class that really ultimately will advance white people. Even if you don't necessarily intend it that way or say it that way, that's what you're going to end up with. That's the history too. That's actually the history. It's not a theory. It actually is the history of social class politics in this country.
So I have to do a bit of a sidebar. Margaret's going to kill me because I was supposed to tell you all in the beginning that there were index cards on each of your seats to ask questions. Oh, you got them? Oh, okay, sorry. She did it and didn't tell me she did it because she didn't trust me to do it. I guess she didn't. But anyway, now is a good time to start passing those to the ends of the aisles. You'll see Nicole and Gardy there gathering them because we're going to, and just after a final question for me, move over to some Q&A with the audience. So, this whole, I want to pick up on this whole thing about race and class. And we were talking backstage about another really important work that was published, actually at this point, several years ago, I guess, called The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, which clearly showed this pattern and trajectory. And what I was sharing with Ta-Nehisi is that I read The Warmth of Other Suns right before I read Between the World and Me. And there was, for me, a lot of resonance between the two. They were like bookends, almost. And I wondered if you saw any reflections of one to the other, how you think do they relate to each other, well, let me stop there. Do they relate to each other?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, I'm going to put some people on the spot. Any of you guys read Warmth of Other Suns? Raise your hand if you have.
A few people.
All of y'all should have.
Yeah. It's powerful.
It's called The Warmth of Other Suns. It's a history of the Great Migration.
By Isabel Wilkerson.
Tremendous. And don't be intimidated by how long it is. Because it's actually a beautiful read. It's a beautiful.
Yeah, it's a page turner.
It actually is a page turner. It's wow. It's a thriller. I don't know, it's always hard to isolate a single book, but I don't know that there's been a more influential book on my own thinking I've read in the past 10 years. And even, much of what I was just talking about just now, about the idea of race as class, I mean, that comes out of Isabel Wilkerson, who tells the story of what happens to these black people who are trying to flee a kind of Jim Crow class politics in the South, and in fact come to New York and find Jim Crow class politics. I think like one of the heartbreaking things about that book, and it kind of cinched it for me. So at that point, when I read that book, this would have been like 2012, I had the idea to write the case for reparations. And I really wanted to read The Warmth of Other Suns, but the way my reading works is regrettably, I don't have much leisure reading. It's usually what I'm working on. And I thought, well, this won't have much to do with what I'm working on. but I really want to read this, so I'll just take the lead to read. And in fact, it was actually the seed of everything that I wanted to do. And that is because one of the things I think Isabel proves in that book is that the people that are coming north, these black folks, are people who are obeying every single rule that America dictates to black people. There's a dialogue in this country that says, if black people would only, you know, and today it goes like, if black people would only pull their pants up. You know, if black people would only learn standard English, if black people would just go on TV with a suit and tie, if, you know, all these, you know, what you know, the young people call respectability politics. That if black people only did X, Y, and Z. And One of the Mother Sons is the case of the if onlys. There's a class of black people that do all of that, and what they find, in fact, is white supremacist Jim Crow oppression. That's their answer to the if only. And so in many ways, it's a heartbreaking read, but at the same time, it's the book that cinched it for me, that closed the door. Because much of the writing, you know, for people that, right, like me, is focused on those black folks who are poor. A great bit of, you know, of it is in the cities of Chicago and the projects. And the reasons for that, because obviously those are people who are suffering the most. But in fact, the black quote-unquote middle class, and I say that because of the wealth differential, black quote-unquote middle class was the real test case for me, because it was, okay, what about people who firmly buy in and do everything that America says you should do? What happens to them? And what you find is, in fact, they get robbed and they get plundered too. And so when I saw that, that really gave me the key to go to write the case for reparations, which in turn led to Between the World and Me. The other part of that is even in what I read at then, because Isabel Wilkerson, I think what she would say is this book is a story of resistance. And in that sense, what she's arguing is that black people have never had the kind of hard power that we think about. Generally have not had the guns, not had the money, you know, to resist in this country. But that what people without those options do, and she says this like in the introduction of the book, is they resist by leaving. That in fact the running was in fact resistance, that you could, you know, in that sense trace it all the way back to the Underground Railroad. And she talks about running as resistance. And that was a really, really powerful notion to me. It's a great book. Everybody, you know, should be criminally underrated.
I agree, and I think it belies the notion of identity politics as well.
It does, yes.
Boy, I could ask you a lot more stuff, but I think it's time to hear from other folks. So let's start with this. And I'm not black, I'm Kanye. You write that the tragedy of the past and present is old, but even within it, there are actors, some who've chosen resistance, and some, like West, who, however blindly, have chosen collaboration.
Kanye, it's just because I'm nobody.
Kanye West.
Kanye West.
Kanye West. Yes. Okay. In your opinion, must the side be chosen, or is there a way to find balance between these two ideas?
Between resistance and collaboration?
Yes.
Yes, the side must be chosen. Especially right now. I stand by most of what I wrote in that essay, but I feel a little bad about it now. Because it was funny, because at the time when I wrote it, there was like this kind of murmur and whisper that Kanye was in fact mentally ill. But there was also, I think, a great feeling and a correct feeling that if you had not examined Kanye West, you should not be diagnosing him. So you should treat him as though, you know, you were your own person and write about it in that way. Since that time, we know that Kanye was actually mentally ill. And so I think, well, the short answer is, as I said, yes, you do have to choose a side. But B, probably, or two, I think had I known, I might not have written that. You know, because it's tough, man. I think, like looking back on it now, the truest part of that essay is, I think, the part about how when you ascend a certain height, if you don't have people around you who you trust, and by trust I mean people who yell at you, people who tell you you're crazy, people who tell you no, and you don't throw them out the room. If you don't have people like that around you, you're in for a tough ride. And I think that's, you know, Kanye. I mean, he's now talked about it, you know, in terms of mental illness and everything. And if no one can take away your phone, I mean, I
I do. I really fear for him. I really, really, like, I was a music journalist for many years. And I'll never forget, I went to a press conference one time where ODB from Wu-Tang had just come out of jail. And the press conference was because he was signed to a new label, to Rockefeller Records, and Dame Dash was there. And they put this big medallion, this big rock medallion on his, around his neck. And then a bunch of journalists asked him questions. And he was totally incoherent. Like, just completely zonked out. You know, but there was this kind of cheering, festive mood. And it was obscene to me that no one said, he's not okay. Like, this is not okay. We shouldn't be laughing and cheering about this. And I think ODB was dead like a year later. You know, I get chills like watching the old, Tupac videos and watching him, go into moments which almost seem like mania. And
I witnessing the unraveling.
Yes. But there were people cheering. Cheering the whole way. And, he was dead just like that. So, the fear I have for Kanye is mortal. This happens to people all the time. It happens to black people, it happens to black artists all the time. And there will be, all kinds of sadness and, X, Y, Z should, something happen. But the question will be left to, I think, people who come, what did you do, though? What did you do? And I don't know if that's on him in terms of pushing people away, but I don't know how you let somebody do this who you love. I don't get it.
So staying on the point around artists, and this is going to be, this is a quiz of all the articles you've written over time. You wrote an article in 2015.
Oh, Lord.
Hope in the Artist, in which you said, and I'm sure you remember saying this, no art I've ever loved takes the offering of hope or despair as its central mission. And a good deal of the art I detest does. And you also said that hope for hope's sake is the enemy of intelligence. Could you talk about what you meant by that?
I don't remember writing that, but whoever wrote that was really good. I totally agree with it. I think like what happens, and maybe this happens because of, again, the unique place black people exist in society. I think when you are a black artist or a black writer, you are called to do things that other artists and other writers are not called to do. When I think about the art I love, hope and despair are not particularly relevant to it. Now, there's joy and suffering in it all the time. As my friend Eve Ewing says, but hope and despair are not opposed. One of the most influential novels, on my writing, for instance, is like Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. I don't finish The Great Gatsby and feel, wow, I really feel hopeful about life. I love Moby Dick. I didn't finish Moby Dick and say, wow, this is such a life-affirming novel. That's not how I feel. I don't feel like that when I read Baldwin. You know what I mean? Now, Baldwin talks about hope, but I don't, when I finish him, I don't feel like I feel great about the future of this country. I feel like I understand things that I did not understand before. I feel deeply enlightened. I feel like I have questions, and questions have been answered. And that's the art that always spoke to me. It enlightened. Why are things this way? Why do things, like hip-hop, when I was a kid, one of the greatest things about hip-hop is I felt like it articulated a world that I lived in around me in a way that I never could have articulated. And in essence, I felt enlightened. And so I feel like hope is fine. We all need hope, but I think people should go to their pastors for hope. I think people should go to their friends for hope. I think people should go to their therapists for hope. Writers are different. Writers live in the real world, in the messy, ugly, conflicted real world. They live in that world that I was just talking about. In this rendition I just gave of America, and this need to remember. I don't know that that's a particularly hopeful rendition, but I do think it's an enlightening one. And so I feel like we have this need to believe that it's going to be okay. But I'm not sure it's going to be okay. And so, if I start out my writing under the preconception, under the notion that I must tell you at the end that it's going to be okay, I feel like I've lied to you. Now, I also feel like if I start out from the beginning telling you that we're all going to burn, I've lied to you too. You know, I should reach that conclusion throughout the text. That's my conclusion. But no one should start out, you know what I mean? You don't start out thinking like that. You know what I mean? I certainly do not. You know, I think about like The Wire. The Wire is one of the greatest pieces of art I've ever seen. I didn't feel hopeful when I was done with The Wire. That wasn't what it gave to me. You know, but it did give me something. You know what I mean? I felt like it gave me power, it gave me knowledge, it enlightened. You know, I hope the work is empowering. I hope it does that. You know, but hope is not, a thing I'm particularly acquainted with as a writer.
Well, you know, one thing we know for sure is that there's a better chance of things ultimately being okay if we're all activated. We are all implicated already.
Yes.
But if we're all activated and very deeply engaged towards some more positive outcomes. And so the question is, what historical issues do you think that the chamber music community has to address if that community wants to generate an inclusive cultural idea of what chamber music is in 2019?
You know what I think? If you allow me, I'll speak more generally to what I think the role of and why I'm actually happy to be. Because I think about this a lot, in terms of where I'm going as a writer. And I actually even think about it in my comic books, and that is the role of art in politics and in society, which I think is actually quite critical and quite, we could have spent like an hour just, because I think people in my world often regard the world of art, the world of myth, the world of symbol as ancillary. So there's this notion that you have, for instance, hard pocketbook issues, you have hard, economic issues, and people who are out here, making music, making fiction, making comic books. And this even extends to, I would argue, to people who are protesting, say, statues and trying to get that these are issues that don't actually have much relationship to the world of policy. But I think art actually is what bounds the world of policy. By which I mean it outlines the borders of what's possible and what's not. I think art is the world of the imagination. And if you don't have the imagination, you can't ever get to the policy in the first place. Let me not make sure that you understand what I'm saying, so you get that I'm not being abstract and airy. It's easier for me to talk about this in the world of harm. So I talk a lot about the policies of white supremacy, about the numbers and what it benefited this country, what was taken from black people, the laws, the actual fact of the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement. But behind all of that is actually regressive art, the world of regressive art. Blackface is not just merely humiliating to black people. It justifies the laws. You understand? Like, it makes Jim Crow possible because if you can repeatedly reinforce in the imagination of a critical mass of this country that black people are subhuman, that they're dumb, that they're children, that they're servile, segregation becomes a lot more tenable. It's the myth, it's the art that actually makes it possible. Birth of a Nation it is not merely a technological film, and it's not just bad because of the roles that people in blackface who are supposed to be black are actually confined to in that movie. It actually was screened at the White House. You understand? Before, I believe it was Wilson. I think it was Wilson who screened it. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, guys. Sorry to be talking a lot. Woodrow Wilson screens Birth of a Nation at the White House. It reinforces his imagination. Woodrow Wilson was, to that point, the most segregationist president in American history. People often talk about, when we talk about the past, they say, well, he was a man of his time. No, Woodrow Wilson was not a man of his time. Woodrow Wilson was a man of actually the 19th century. He actually was a step back. He fired, the entire, staff of black people working in the civil service at the White House. He had worked hard when he was president of Princeton to keep Princeton as segregated as he possibly could. And it was the art. It was the art that reinforced his version of the world. And it isn't, and when people, argue for the taking down these statues, You know, when the young man up at Yale, for instance, I don't know if you guys know about this, threw a trash can through the stained glass window. Because those were the symbols that reinforced the actual politics. And so, like, when I think about myself now, even in my writing, I've spent a lot of time trying to argue with people over facts. And it's clear to me that you can outline all the facts in the world and you can be right and people won't see it. And that's because you haven't gotten to the deeper level of symbol. You haven't gotten to their imagination. You haven't gotten to what they believe is possible. When you talk about like the response to Obama, for instance, you know, in Trump, as far as I'm concerned, that's all about art and imagination. That's all about the idea of Obama as a symbol offending the white imagination of where black people are supposed to sit in this society. And how did that imagination get formed in the first place? And then you have to go back to art. You have to go back to symbols. So, I mean, in many senses, it's funny to come to this point, you know, at this point in my career, I actually think if you're thinking long term, the art is actually more powerful than the policy. Because it's the art that shapes it. It's the actual, you know, talk about symbols and conversations that actually make possible, you know, what policies we can have. If a critical mass in this country does not believe that Muslims are human beings, does not believe that black people are human beings, does not believe that Hispanics and Latinos are human beings, does not believe that women of any race, culture, or ethnicity are fully human beings, then all the laws in the world will not matter. It just won't matter. We went through this during a period of redemption where we tried to pass laws, but the country itself was not convinced of the humanity of black people, and those laws therefore had no meaning. So until you can get to that root level, to that almost instinctual level where art lives, where music lives, you know, I think all the policy in the world won't matter. I hope that's applicable to what you guys are doing. You know, because I think about
we're actually out of time, and you've ended it in a perfect way. I want to thank you so much for coming and being with us today and providing an inspirational start to our gathering together, and we look forward to your new book. Thank you.